Chair. For the record, Delegate Bob Long, I'm here to testify and introduce House Bill 113, election in-person voter proof of identification. This bill would pass, would put it up as referendum and put it on the ballot and let the voters make that choice whether they want to have voter ID or not. I didn't actually do a survey, but we kind of did well, it was kind of a survey. We put something on Facebook and asked, do you believe it? People should have to show voter ID at the polling places. We had over 20,000 comments. And there were a few that said they don't want to see voter suppression, which I don't either. And we can work through that. If it we want to make sure once it goes on the ballot, if it's passed, we'll work through whatever it takes to make sure there's no voter suppression. If anything, if we don't pass this, we're kind of voter suppression the opposite way, because, you know, let the voters make this choice. I know we're going to have on the ballot about legalizing marijuana, which I don't agree with legalizing it, but I will vote for that to be put on the ballot. That's the way it should be. There's 35 states right now that show voter ID. And there's provisions in the ballot that if you show up at the polling place and you don't have voter ID, there's different things. You can even go down as far as casting a provisional ballot. So this is not, you know, we don't want to have any voter suppression whatsoever. We want to encourage, again, people to come out and vote and to bring this state together and this country. I mean, what happened in this country, it broke my heart. I mean, I remember the Vietnam War. I remember when Martin Luther King was killed. I mean, this was bad this time. I mean, to see our state capitol under that kind of siege, and you know, I do believe that if we can pass this and the rest of the country pass voter ID, we can stop a lot of this. And that's, you know, that's why I brought this bill.
Thank you. The next two witnesses will each have 2 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Wayne Adamson whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say I'd like to testify. Testifying in favor of this bill. I believe we need a voter ID requirement in order to help assure that only those who are eligible to vote in Maryland are able to do so. I don't think this bill is the cure-all for all the voter fraud, but I think it's a good start. From personal experience, I can tell you that a sister-in-law of mine who moved out of this state many years ago, but she had her address at my house because she was living on a boat here in Anne Arundel County, and so this was her official address. So all correspondence came through our house. What happened after she left to go to Florida, she and her husband, she continued to get mail from the Board of Elections. I sent this mail back with a notification on there that this person was no longer in the state of Maryland. I can tell you that she continues to get mail here, and I have on multiple occasions sent it back, including the last election. And so it's obvious that these people are not being taken off the rolls. So it's to me, it's apparent that people could vote in their name illegally. I feel that this is a risk, and it certainly gives the lack of confidence in eligible voters that people like this are still on the rolls. The problem extends well beyond such individuals who've moved out of state, as far as this type of fraudulent vote that can happen. But I think the requirement for an identification assures that at least the voter resides in the state at the address indicated.
Thank you. We're going to have to ask you to wrap up, Mr. Adamson.
Okay. I don't think this is I think this is something that has already been pointed out is in favor of many people. A majority of people, Black, white, Hispanic, are all in favor of ID, and it certainly worked well in other states. And I think that this is something that we should add to the state of Maryland.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Lori Graff for 2 minutes, please.
I did not sign up for this bill. I'm on the next one, 93.
Oh, sorry, you're right. Lisa I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name. You can pronounce it for everyone here.
Thank you. I'm an unfavorable. Is that okay?
Yes, yep.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lisa Klingenmeyer. I'm here today representing Marylanders Against Poverty, a coalition of service providers, faith communities, and advocacy groups that works on policies and programs that address and end poverty. We're here today in strong opposition of this bill, as we are every year there is a voter ID bill, because it's unnecessary and it puts up an undue burden in front of the constitutional right to vote. Marylanders Against Poverty is a coalition of service providers. We work every day with low-income Marylanders from marginalized backgrounds, and I can tell you many of them struggle to obtain identification. I'm a social worker by training. I do casework. I've done casework with people experiencing homelessness, and it is extraordinarily difficult to get identification. Even things like utility bills or bank statements, many folks in poverty don't have these things. They are unbanked, and even if I could get someone an ID today, it doesn't mean that they would have it on the day of the election, because it can get stolen, it could get lost, it could deteriorate in the elements if they're living their life outside. When I talked and worked with people experiencing homelessness, they would often reference how voting was the one thing that felt like they connected to their community. They were part of our democracy. So if we're going to put any burden in front of that, it has to meet the highest level of scrutiny, and this bill does not. There are numerous studies that there is no widespread voter fraud, especially in-person voter fraud, where this legislation would actually make a difference. This is a solution looking for a problem. And this bill in particular is a constitutional amendment. There are only 2 states in the entire country that have voter ID enacted through a constitutional amendment. And North Carolina was a 3rd state, but theirs was just ruled unconstitutional and is not in effect. If this bill was enacted as a constitutional amendment, and then we did find there was disenfranchisement, we'd have to re-amend our constitution to fix it. So we strongly oppose this legislation. We thank you for your time and urge an unfavorable report.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm going to ask the first question, then I see 2 others. But I'll call you like my kids call folks by their first name, but they put Mr. or Mrs. Miss. I'll say Miss Lisa because I don't want to butcher your name. Have you found in your work that voter identification affects certain populations negatively? And if so, what are those populations?
Absolutely. And not only for my own work, but research also shows that this bill would disproportionately impact women, individuals fleeing intimate partner violence, folks with a disability, older adults, Black and Brown Marylanders, essentially the folks who are disproportionately likely to experience homelessness, but also be disproportionately likely to not have the ID needed in order to vote.
Thank you. I see Delegate Buckle and then Delegate Griffiths. Delegate Buckle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I did have a question for the, I don't want to mistake your name either, and I don't want to call you by your first name, but the woman who just testified. You mentioned that in the work that you do, it's difficult for certain populations, particularly some homeless populations, to secure identification, photo identification that I would assume they could use in a wide variety of contexts in which it's required. Do you think that, and I'm not saying that maybe this particular bill provides for this or doesn't provide for that, but if we had a system where we said, hey, someone wants to go register to vote, they may be homeless or they may be down on their luck in a disadvantaged situation where they don't have a traditional driver's license or other photo identification. And we provide them an opportunity that when they go to register to vote, the state will actually pay for and provide them with a photo ID. Not just that they can use to vote, but that they can use for whatever other purposes. Wouldn't that help them in life if you were registering someone that was homeless from that community to say, hey, you know, you have the right to participate in our system. We're going to register you to vote. And when we do that, the state, free of charge to you with no administrative burdens, we're going to get you a photo ID that we're going to give you that you can use, in whatever context you need for the coming years. Would that be helpful to those populations to have that?
I mean, I think if the intent of the legislation or the intent of the General Assembly is to make sure that we are getting free and affordable and low barrier identification for folks experiencing homelessness, that would be a great standalone bill. And I'm sure Marylanders Against Poverty would happily support any effort to get more identification for folks who are struggling to obtain it. But we would not support that as a part of being able to vote.
Okay, so you think it would be good to get them the identification, but you don't think that they should have to display the identification in connection with their voting? Is that fair?
So no, obtaining identification is extraordinarily difficult. In order to get a state ID in Maryland, you need a social security card and a birth certificate. In order to get a social security card, you need a birth certificate and ID. In order to get a birth certificate, you need a social security card and ID. So most of the folks we work with cannot even get the first piece to get the other pieces.
Right.
So in order to get that by election day would be, it's extremely difficult. And so any legislation that would be helping get folks ID is great, but not something that is tied to voting.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Griffith, then I see Delegate Jones. Delegate Griffith?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, ma'am. Sorry, I don't want to butcher your last name either. Listen, I get Griffin and Griffiths all the time, and mine's, you know, relatively easy, so I get it. You were talking about the data supporting that certain marginalized communities have a hard time getting ID, therefore they'd be disenfranchised to vote. So obviously that's going to be data driven. So how many individuals have you encountered, you're obviously recording this, that would not be able to vote if we had a voter ID law?
I mean, several. I don't do casework right now. I'm a full-time lobbyist, but before I did this work, I did casework with people experiencing homelessness. Part of my job was securing ID, and that was the bulk of my work. And it was so difficult because, like I mentioned, once someone attained ID today, the folks I worked with were living outside. They were living in shelters where their belongings were stolen. They were lost. They deteriorated in the elements. They might get arrested and have it thrown away because they were living their private lives in a public space, and that often encountered them with the criminal justice system. So easily half my job when I was doing casework was helping folks get ID. So several folks. If an election was held tomorrow and an ID was needed, there'd be several folks. I couldn't give you an exact number, but I can tell you there's estimates of 30 to 50,000 people experience homelessness annually in Maryland, and I'm sure they have at some point lost or had their ID misplaced. And so I think there are many folks who would not be able to vote with a law like this.
I mean, so several is what we can definitively say. And in the greater population, do we have an idea of how many registered voters in the state of Maryland do not have an ID?
I don't know if we have that data in Maryland specifically. I think we have data kind of nationally that shows about 11% of the population generally may or may not have the ID required to vote at any given time. I think it's something like 21 million people across the United States. I don't know if that analysis has been done in Maryland. I haven't seen any data to that. So it's just sort of if Maryland mirrors sort of nationally what the experience is.
I just want to make sure as we're looking at these things to, have free, fair, and easy access to voting, that we're doing it based upon actual data. And I want to be careful that we're not using our own preconceived notions and our own feelings in looking at this legislation. So thank you very much for your time.